Good evening and welcome. It's been 12 days since the ban on single-use plastics in Fiji. Tonight on the show, we're speaking with the Ministry of Waterways and Environment and the Ministry of Economy and asking whether the Plastic-Free Fiji campaign is on track to achieve its intended objectives. And we have with us the Acting Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Waterways and Environment, Mr. Ritesh Das. Good evening. And the Head of Climate Change at the Ministry of Economy, Mr. Nilesh Prakash. Thank you for joining us. Let's talk about the ban first. 12 days since implementation, and you've had a busy 2 weeks, right? Mr. Das, tell us about how that's been, how the implementation has been.
We've been talking about the ban that was coming on the 1st of January for a while. And it was pleasing to know that in the first couple of days, there was an overwhelming level of compliance at all levels across various chains that we surveyed as the Ministry of Environment. So there's been general and overwhelming level of support that the people actually thrown behind this initiative in recognition of their responsibility towards the environment and the damaging impacts of single-use plastic.
Mr. Prakash, I'll ask you the same question from the Ministry of Economy's perspective, because the Climate Change Division is responsible for implementation, right? So talk to us about how that has been so far.
I think, as the Acting PS has mentioned, there's been overwhelming sort of support, for the single-use plastic ban, particularly in terms of compliance. So we've had, very interesting, past 12 days in terms of clarifying and very proactively, reaching out to people in terms of clarifying misinformation, really providing them information in terms of, what they needed to do, and clarifying, what sort of bags, are no longer in use and what stays. So it's been a very busy 2 weeks, yeah.
Mr. Das, looking at the single-use plastic bag ban, this of course is not something that's been sprung on the general public overnight. There have been announcements that have been made at least 18 months in advance, preparing the public to make alternative arrangements for use of containers and also for whatever purposes that they use plastics for. Why was this not initiated in phases, and if it was, how was this implemented in phases in the past before we came to this ban altogether?
I think, to look at, this ban that's come about, I'll take it back in history to 2017, when the first 10 cents levy on single-use plastic bags was introduced. Of course, that was done as a means to encourage people to move to more environmental-friendly options. That levy was then in 2018 increased to 20 cents. And at that time, a policy intent was announced by the government that there will be a single plastic ban in 2020, which has obviously come into effect on the 1st of January. So, in essence, if you talk about this journey of phasing out single-use plastic, it's been since 2017 to 2019, so 3 years in making, really. So that's more than ample time for people to get used to the change.
So, Mr. Prakash, looking at the clarifications that you had mentioned on single-use plastics, people on social media and also in social circles had started talking about exactly what that means. Now, of course, the law has become pretty clear that it is anything that's under 50 microns. But in day-to-day term, could you tell us examples of what is a single-use plastic and which ones are not allowed for trade or for distribution?
The Section 45 of the Environmental Management Act 2005, 45A, Section 45A actually prohibits the use of a carry bag, which is of course, which in thickness is less than 50 microns. And principally these bags, carry bags should be used for carrying or transporting goods. But there are some exceptions to this, so for example, people have been asking us, for example, how about, bin liners, the garbage bags, they are obviously allowed. And those, carry bags that are integral to the packaging of a product, that is of course allowed, like for example, plastic bags that are used to, carry your bread, your sliced bread, for example, bags that are, where we carry our sugar, rice, and other food stuff, that is allowed. So I think, the common things that, that we've been using, prior to 1 January, say for example, those checkout bags, which we used to get at the checkout those carry bags, with handles, they have, some marketing information from the various retailers. So those kind of, checkout bags, we no longer see. And also, which is now no longer being used, are those tearaway bags, that we used to, get in supermarkets, where we, put our fresh produce, and of course, we used to get that in the butcher section of supermarkets as well. So those bags are obviously, in thickness, they are less than 50 microns, and they are no longer being used.
So why in particular just single-use plastic bag ban? What about the bags that are thicker than 50 microns? Why are they not being banned out, or why have they not been phased out either?
I think by industry standards, a bag, which is 50 microns and above, there is an element of reusability in that. So which that means that, you can use a particular bag, which is 50 microns and above a number of times, and it still remains intact in its form. So I think that's something we have to understand, that the bags of 50 microns and above, they can be reused a number of times. And I think if you look at the current sort of configuration now that, 50 bags which are 50 microns and above, certain supermarkets or certain, sort of retail outlets will have these bags, and it attracts a 50 cents levy. So which again, that cost factor should be a deterrent there. So of course, if you don't want to pay that 50 cents, so which means you don't actually get a bag.
That in fact, the use of the bags above 50 microns has become sort of an issue of contention, and this is, of course, to both of you. Do you think that defeats the purpose of putting the ban in place, especially when you think about the environmental concerns that seems to be the driving factor behind the ban in the first place? And that's, you're familiar with that criticism. You've been hearing it on social media as well, right?
If you look at, in totality, the use of plastics in Fiji, through this ban, I would like to think that, we've actually captured and resolved a large chunk of plastic usage in Fiji, which is the single-use plastic. So that's been significantly reduced. Now, obviously, you can't do this whole thing at once. There's phases that, you have to, do it in. As my colleague has pointed out here, the more than 50 micron plastic bag, currently, incurs a levy, incurs a fee that shopkeepers actually charge. And I've actually witnessed that in most instances, that is also a deterrent where consumers are now opting for their own eco-friendly options versus actually buying those bags. So we are hoping that, this will continue to incentivize consumers to use reusable options of packaging in various shopping outlets.
Mr. Prakash, we'll let you answer that question right after the break. Mr. Prakash, let's carry the discussion on from where we left off in the last segment. Talking about why plastic bags above 50 microns are still allowed, and does it defeat the environmental objectives that you're trying to achieve with the legislation?
I think the fact that we have plastic bags, which are 50 microns and above, is being made available in the market, that's an interim solution. That was the response, as we, understand, there is almost, universal compliance to the legislation, so that's obviously a very good thing. But I think in the interim, of course, the industry has responded by providing, those thicker bags. But I think, we all need to understand that the policy intent and the policy signal from government is that we need to limit or rather reduce the number of, plastic bags which is, being used in Fiji. So I think, the fact that we have a 50 cents levy on those thicker bags, which is available at point of sale in some retail outlets, that itself should serve as a deterrent. That the cost should be a deterrent.
Now, Mr. Das, this was not necessarily met with a lot of resistance, but of course it was something that people had to come to terms with come the beginning of the new year. Ideally, of course, it would have been nice to get some information out there to the public, but unfortunately, most of the time that was taken up about advocating for this was overshadowed by TC Sarai. Moving ahead with this, though, this is not a novel new idea. Of course, we've got Thailand that has come on board with a single-use plastic bag ban as well as Maharashtra in India. They've come up with some very novel ways to deal with this problem of not being able to use single-use plastic bags. but recently we've had cases where people have complained that they have been served in sort of unsanitary and unhygienic ways. Case in point, a customer took a picture of his sliced meat that was packed into a carton. Can you comment on that? Mr. Das or Mr. Prakash?
I think that incident about a customer having his cut meat packed in a carton, I think that is an isolated case, and we have certainly gotten in touch with the particular supermarket to discuss that matter. And what we've been informed is that the customer was provided an option, that there is a particular option which is the styrofoam tray, and then once the meat is placed there, then it will be cling wrapped. So I think the option was provided to the customer, and the customer was then asked that you've got to pay 50 cents for it. But the customer actually opted to have his cut meat placed in a box. So that's obviously an isolated case, and we hope that supermarkets and retail outlets will be very vigilant and will ensure that this does not get repeated. But I think all in all, what we are now seeing is that most of the supermarkets, especially those that have butcher sections, they actually have very hygienic way of selling their meat products.
Mm-hmm.
So which is they're having reusable bags which customers can use, and some of course are charging, and that is really at the discretion of the individual supermarkets. Yeah.
Mr. Das, last year we had the minister himself comment numerous times about clogged waterways, and most of the garbage that was clogging those waterways was actually plastics. Most of them were single-use plastics. Can you tell us about exactly why it's so necessary for us in small developing nations like Fiji to initiate bans like this at this point in time? Why now?
I think we all have a responsibility to our environment. And in Fiji, if you look at Fiji, pollution, is a key challenge. And one of the biggest contributors to that pollution, to blocked waterways, is plastic bags. It not only affects waterways, but it also kills marine life. It's estimated that plastics take thousands of years to degrade, and when it does, it results into microplastics. Once again, which is ingested by marine life. We as consumers of some of this marine life also ingest this in ourselves. So down the food chain, we as human beings are also affected by our actions. So hence it was important to take this bold step to not only protect our ecosystem, but also to safeguard our health.
And there's already research to suggest that we have, our marine life has microplastics in it, right? Does that worry you?
No, indeed. I think in the research which you're referring to is obviously done by USP, and they found that microplastics have indeed ended up in our food chain. So which is of course alarming, and it should be a concern, and which is why we've undertaken this a measure of banning single-use plastics. But I think another important reason is that we need to keep our environment in a very pristine state. We have our number one industry. Tourism industry is our number one industry. So we've got to make keep our environment in a pristine state for this industry. So I think that's very important. And I think the issue of single-use plastics ending up in rivers and waterways, I think and that then causes flash flooding, that sort of thing. So I think these are the concerns.
If you allow us to digress just for a few minutes, there's been people, those who are not necessarily behind this idea, they're not looking at the bigger picture here. The detractors are mostly saying that this is some sort of a scheme. There's conspiracy theories about the government not having enough money, which is why they're saying that the government is putting in place all these initiatives just as a revenue-making scheme. Can you comment on that? Of course, it seems quite absurd, but we'd like your views on that.
Sorry, that is obviously not true. I think, if you look at the background, which PS Das mentioned, in terms of if you look at the ECAL levy, for example, we had the ECAL, the plastic bag levy, 10 cents introduced in 2017, then it was increased to 20 cents, and now we have the plastic bag levy, which stands at 50 cents, which is for thicker bags, 50 microns and above. So if you look at, this, sort of progression in terms of, the escalating, plastic levy, I think the overall intention there is not to generate revenue, but to actually inculcate a culture where people actually, start operating in an environment where they don't need plastic bags. So like I said, before, that, the cost should be a deterrent. So the more you need to pay for a unit of plastic bag, that should be a factor, causing you not to sort of, ask for those bags. So that's been the policy intention from the beginning. And of course, I mean, we've done some analysis, quick analysis, from the ECAL numbers. So we've seen actually the average number of plastics, used annually since 2017 has actually, come down quite drastically, and we'd definitely, post 1 January, we would see the numbers even come down further.
As far as alternatives go, we have been talking about alternatives, and if we again go back to the 15 microns thicker plastic bags, do you think that if there was a complete and total ban on all plastic bags, retailers and consumers alike would be forced to find environmentally friendly alternatives rather than still having the option of buying a 50-cent plastic bag?
I think the way to sort of look at this entire space of single-use plastics, which of course includes, plastic bags, it includes styrofoam, it includes cutlery, and other stuff. So I think, this is an incremental approach. We've started off with the plastic bags, and of course, the intent to phase out styrofoam has also been announced from 1 January, 2021. So obviously, for with respect to that, we will be undertaking, industry consultations. We'll be, of course, consulting, restaurant owners, for example, those who are, predominantly using those styrofoam containers. So this is something I think, it's a process. We've started it, and with the campaign, advocacy, and education, we should see that, there is a behavioral change.
Okay. We'll have more for you when we come back from our next break. When we finished our discussion before the break, we were talking about incentives and alternatives that businesses were provided. And Mr. Prakash, this is to you. Are there incentives for businesses that use eco-friendly alternatives like biodegradable bags?
Indeed, I think to promote sustainable solutions and really to really have the transition in the domestic market, government has introduced incentives. Say, for example, the duty on the importation of non-woven bags, so that's been increased, from 15 to 32%, and that's done primarily to protect local industry so that they can, manufacture the non-woven bags locally. And of course, for these industries who manufacture non-woven bags, the duty has been reduced to fiscal duty has been reduced to 0, so that they can get these raw materials and manufacture these locally.
Looking at how this impacts the average Joe or the ordinary Fijian, Mr. Das, how do you think that this would help us?
We all need to realize that, before we are a user of plastic bags, we are citizens of this beautiful country, that we call Fiji, that is, largely unspoilt and surrounded by the ocean. We all have a responsibility to protect the environment we are in, not so much for our generation, but for the generations to come. The environmental impact that we all face today, not only in Fiji but globally, is known to many. We have to take decisive steps today if we are to prevent the future generation to pay the price of our neglect. Which is why I think, if you're looking at the step that we took today, it is for the benefit of mankind today and for the benefit of the ecosystem and the environment that we have today. It was necessary to do so. And I'd like to iterate one point in time that we as human beings need nature more than nature needs us. So it's in our remit. It's actually our obligation that we protect the environment, which has given us so much.
But humans are creatures of habit, and breaking habits is very difficult. Sometimes when you start off a new initiative, just like as you would with your New Year's resolutions, it takes some time to getting used to, and if it becomes too much of a burden, it's outside of your comfort zone. People fall back to, shall we say, unsustainable practices. How does one combat that, and what does the ministry plan to do to help those people out and try to incentivize them?
fact, I'll take you back to my earlier comment around the journey that we've been on, the transition journey that the government has actually embarked on since 2017. So there's been a constant phase of education of our people around the need for change. And you rightly pointed out that any change is not easy, and people do tend to revert to old practices. But what's been very pleasing to note is that through the phase approach that the government actually took and the journey that they've actually undertaken for a longer period of time, we've now seen that people actually have taken this on board fully. Even before the ban came in place, we could see a large number of supermarkets already compliant. We could see a large number of consumers already opting for environmental friendly options. So that gave us confidence as the government that this change is going to stick. And I think people have seen the benefit of taking such a bold step. In that it is the right thing to do for our environment.
Mr. Prakash, this is a tech-savvy world now. Of course, everyone wants to be on top of the trends. You, of course, have to monitor what's happening online as well. From the ministry's perspective, in the past 12 days, what have you seen online? Is it supportive or is it mostly negative and words of, shall we say, not very nice things that people have said about the ban?
Generally, I think people are very receptive to it. The comments which we are receiving, they are saying that good on kudos to you guys. You've been able to figure this out. So I think that's a very good thing. Generally, so it's a very positive environment out there. The Ministry of Waterways and Environment, they've undertaken surveillance, and they're telling us that there is almost 100% compliance with that. So I think we just need to build on this momentum, and there's further things that we need to do in the space of single-use plastics, for example, styrofoams. So I think we need to build on this education momentum. We need to continue with the advocacy so that people get it right and the industry then responds accordingly.
Of course, single-use plastics are not the only form of plastics out there, like we talked about before the break, and you spoke about plastic spoons, plastic forks and straws, etc., that are still out there. Do you see a development in the legislation going on into the future years? Perhaps expand the definition of what a plastic is, or include more items under the ban?
Well, this is something that we've got to actually look at, because the policy intent has been announced with the budget announcement last year, where we actually look at straws, single-use cutlery, etc., including the announcement of the phase out of the styrofoam. So this is something we will need to look at, but of course we will need to undertake consultation with various stakeholders to be able to rightly inform the legislation and or any regulations that need to be put in place.
Mr. Das, the government had also put in place some measures to help out those companies that would like to be a little more environmentally friendly by reducing, I think it was taxes on and duties on those bamboo products, biodegradable products as well coming into the country. We've got the styrofoam ban that's going to be coming into effect next year. Of course, this would pretty much be like a pilot plan, seeing how the public reacts to that. Mr. Prakash and Mr. Das, how would you answer the question as to what the government is planning to do before the implementation of the styrofoam packaging ban in the aftermath of what's happened with the single-use plastic bag ban?
I think if you look at it, and I think the work that is being done by Star Printry, for example, they now have alternatives to those styrofoam containers which we get in our restaurants. They have actually these paper boxes which is glazed with wax, and it can actually hold liquid. So I think that's a very good industry response. So we are already seeing that the industry response is there, and they're actually quite ahead of the game. So I think this is what we need to be able to to see that this is something we need a groundswell of these initiatives.
I mean, it's great that company is doing that. I mean, on the other hand, we have we heard the news of M. Hanif Industries finding a way around the legislation by just producing thicker plastic bags. I mean, so again, and I think we'll keep coming back to this. So does the Ministry of Economy plan on sort of doing something about that? Are you going to continue letting producers do that if they want to?
Okay, I mean, we all understand, these thicker bags have been made available, and has been a response, in transition. They obviously had to, have these sort of solutions. I mean, if you don't, pack your meat, for example, in a hygienic manner, what else do you do? I mean, one thing, obviously, as consumers of, whoever consumes meat, what they can do is carry your containers. But if you don't do that, then obviously, as part of the customer service, of course, retail outlets, supermarkets, they will need to provide some options. But I think going forward, and this is a bigger policy question, what can we do? And this is where the dialogue and the collaboration with the industry needs to happen. We need to, advocate that the policy intention is that we need to reduce, on a continuous sort of basis, the amount of plastics which we are using. So what can we do? We need to be creative about this.
Even to Mr. Das, I mean, that's what the conversation around social media seems to be as well, that what people are concerned about is whether we're truly going to be a plastic-free Fiji or if it's just a title that we're following.
I think one must not forget the magnitude of the step that we've taken. As I alluded earlier, by doing what we did effective from 1st of January, the amount of plastic usage that we've reduced in Fiji is significant. Obviously, you can't do all at one shot. There needs to be a transitionary phase, and the use of plastic, that's above 50 microns at the moment. Whilst it's necessary today, it's true today, it's in practice today, may not be relevant, in future. But for that phase out to come through, alternatives will have to be developed. Now, my colleague here, there was a very good example yesterday when we were discussing this topic around one particular company that actually makes environmental friendly bags that can actually carry about 20 kilos in one bag. So now, as I said earlier, necessity is the mother of invention. And now we've seen more and more companies coming up with suitable options that can actually that does have the strength, more than the plastic bags, but doesn't have the necessary adverse environment impacts.
Right. Stay with us. We'll be back right after a short break. Welcome back. We're now joined by the Director Environment at the Ministry of Environment and Waterways, Ms. Sandeep Kaur. Ms. Sandeep, thank you for joining us tonight. So let's talk about enforcement now, since your division directly handles that. What are the penalties in place for businesses and manufacturers who are not following or complying with the ban?
Thank you so much for having me on the show. So the Section 45A of the Environment Management Act is very clear, and it states a person who manufactures a plastic bag that is prohibited under Section 45A of the Act commits an offence and is liable upon conviction to a fine not exceeding 500,000 or to a term imprisonment not exceeding 7 years or both. A person who sells, supplies, or distributes a plastic bag to another person or makes a plastic bag, again, which is prohibited under Section 45A of the Environment Management Act, and it makes it available to a customer for carrying goods purchased or to be purchased from a retailer, commits an offence and is liable upon conviction to a fine not exceeding 150,000 or to a term of imprisonment of 2 years, not exceeding 2 years or both. So those are the penalties under the Environment Management Act, Section 45A, which came into force on January 1, 2020.
Just so that there's no confusion, this is an absolute law. There is no loopholes against it. If you have been in breach of this particular ban, whether as a retailer or as a manufacturer, you will be liable for conviction, whether to a fine or to prison term, correct?
If you are not complying.
If you're not compliant.
Yes.
Just to clear the air on what that means. Now, say, for example, for the ordinary person that is not a businessman, is not a manufacturer, you go off to do your shopping, or you're just out and about and you happen to see someone that has plastic bags, whether it's a small shop or it's a big retailer, what do you do in those instances? Do you report them, and how do you go about doing that?
So if anyone sees that, anyone who is violating Section 45A of the Environment Management Act, they can contact the Department of Environment. There is a toll-free number, 1520, and tell us that this particular business is not complying, or a person is selling, supplying or distributing a plastic bag, which is prohibited by law. Then we will send our inspectors to verify that information, and then if there is non-compliance, then we will prepare case files for prosecution.
So is it always a sort of a reactive measure, or is it also teams going out into the field?
So from January 1 this year, when this section came into force, our officers are already out and about. We have officers in the Central Division, Northern Division, and Western Division that have been carrying out compliance, and we are happy to see there's a very good level of compliance, both by the big supermarkets, retailers, and also the small businesses as well. So it's not, we do take this very seriously, and our officers are already carrying out compliance inspections.
Have there been any situations where you found traders not to be compliant?
There has been some, and we're working on those non-compliance.
Are you at liberty to say what sort of non-compliance it was?
So basically, some supermarkets were packing their produce in or. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Oh, they were packing their
produce
fruits
that they
into plastic bags that were less than 50 microns.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So just on that note, before we move further, let's just sort of contextualize this, yeah? I had done some shopping before the ban came into effect, and of course those plastics were still available. On New Year's Day itself, I went out to a particular retailer, I'll refrain from naming them, and that particular retailer had alternatives available in the fresh produce and in the meat section, but they had clearly stated that customers who were going to use those thicker plastic bags would be charged a particular amount of money for use of that. Say, for example, there was a certain amount for each plastic bag that was used, and that, of course, the proceeds of that would be going to the company because they were providing that particular service. Now, I went to a different supermarket, and I saw that they had completely no plastic bags that were available over there, that they were pretty much encouraging people to use and bring their own forms of packaging. In instances like that, how do you regulate what's happening over there for companies that do provide alternatives and those that don't?
So basically, I think it was mentioned by PS earlier that there are like the option of people getting their own containers and other things if they're coming to shop. In terms of packaging their meat and fruits and other things. So it's up to the consumer whether they get that alternative, or it's up to the shops to provide. But basically, as far as we can tell from our compliance inspection, most of the retailers are providing bags that are greater than 50 and above for packaging of fruits and meat and other things.
So what we're saying is the prerogative lies completely with the supermarket, right? Or the retailers.
Yes, it is. And also, if you are going to a supermarket and you're going to buy meat or something, you can always take
I guess it makes sense as a consumer as well. You would likely go to a retailer that gives you those sort of different sorts of options to make it easier for you as a consumer. Right?
All the retailer shops, we have been to retailers, and so, basically also we have been to markets carrying out some compliance inspections, and there is as an alternative available.
Stay with us. We'll carry on the discussion right after the break. So, Mr. Das, let's talk about enforcement in our final segment. And we're asking about some of the awareness sessions that you did with the retailers prior to the 1st of January 2020. on the enforcement aspect and the legal aspects of this?
Okay, before the ban came into place, and obviously it was announced 18 months in advance, as I mentioned, and it was confirmed through legislative changes during the last budget. And since then, there's been a lot of communication, through various mediums around what you can do if you're a retailer, if you're a manufacturer, or even if you're a user as a consumer. We've actually had forums through established mediums like Facebook for people to share their stories about what they are doing to contribute towards an environmentally friendly option of packaging and moving away from single-use plastic bags.
Now, Sandeep, looking at those who are non-compliant, those who breach the ban, is there any sort of grace period that is given to them for not adhering to the ban, or is there absolute no-drop policy? The law is pretty much black and white on it. If
So
you're
the
non-compliant, you must pay.
The law is pretty much black and white, and it came into force on January 1, 2020. So the department is enforcing the law as is, and there is no grace period. But like I said, there is a very good level of compliance throughout the country, and we hope that people will comply.
So we have given some concessions to small and medium enterprise, small and micro enterprises, and so I mean, when we talk about policy, Mr. Das, how do you sort of strike that balance between ensuring that there is compliance while also ensuring that it doesn't become burdensome on the financially disadvantaged?
So when we come up with any policies, obviously all these factors are taken into consideration. And when you talk about concession, there's apparently no waivers or no concessions given on this specific legislation that's actually come into force on the 1st of January. What we have done is actually clarified some of the clauses in the legislation that people were not very clear on. For example, what constitutes an integral part of the packaging. Basically what that means is, if a manufacturer, producer, or assembler of a particular produce or good actually packages it before it's sold and puts it on shelf, in a pre-packed form, that's in plastic, that's allowable. So we've clarified that, and that actually applies to small and medium enterprises operators as well.
And it's this clarification that was the sort of the initial, I guess, catalyst for turbulence, right? Especially on social media. So there was a wide range of information coming out, and especially going into 2021 with the styrofoam ban. Talk to us about some of the lessons that you've learned.
With any change, it's important that dialogue and consultation with the relevant stakeholders is done. And in this particular instance as well, there were consultations actually held. By announcing that policy intent last year around styrofoam, work will be done in terms of consulting with various stakeholders. Already, if I look at various food operators, where styrofoam containers are used, some of them are already compliant. Some are already moving away from those styrofoam boxes, which I must add, is not only an environmental issue, can potentially cause health risks as well. So it's pleasing to note that once the intent is announced, people are being proactive about it and actually moving away from these options into a much more user-friendly, environment-friendly options. And there are companies here, and we talk about Strap Entry, who are taking very decisive investment steps to move in this direction. And support the government in its quest for a cleaner environment.
Thank you very much for coming on to the show, and we wish the relevant ministries all the very best in the year, and we hope that you have a wonderful year ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
And that's all we have for you on the show tonight. Join us again next week. Have a good evening.